The wind was soft that Friday afternoon, brushing through the tall pines as if trying to greet the lone truck rolling up the gravel road. Inside the truck, the driver, a quiet man named Evan, let out a long breath. It had been months since he'd been able to visit his cabin. Months of work. Travel, pressure, and too many people needing too many things from him. Out here in the mountains where the air tasted cleaner and life slowed down, he felt like he could finally take a full breath again. His cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was a simple wooden place tucked between trees and perched, beside a little creek that could be heard bubbling even from the driveway. He had bought it years ago, long before the area turned into a managed HOA community. Back then, no one cared how late you arrived, what color your porch light was, or if you left your trash bin outside an extra night. But as more cabins were built and more people bought lots for vacation homes, an HOA had been formed to keep the community orderly. That was the polite explanation. The real reason was that some people simply loved having control. Still, the cabin itself hadn't changed. The porch still creaked in the same old spots. The chimney still leaned just barely off-center. And the steady hush of the creek still made Evan feel like the world wasn't as loud and unmanageable as it seemed everywhere else. He parked the truck, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle around him as he opened the door. His back cracked from the long drive and he muttered a tired laugh. "It's been too long," he whispered as he stepped down, stretching his limbs. It felt good to be back. He grabbed his overnight bag from the passenger's seat and slung it over his shoulder. Most of what he needed was already inside the cabin: extra clothes, tools, some old cook pans he never remembered to replace. This weekend wasn't about chores or fixing anything. He just needed a place to rest, where no one knew him, no one needed him, no one expected anything from him, or so he thought. The moment he turned toward the cabin steps, he felt the prickle of eyes on him. Not the kind of look that came from a passing hiker or a nosy squirrel. This was the prickly, heavy sort of stare that belonged to someone with an opinion they were already forming. Across the narrow road, near a different cabin, with a wide porch and far too many HOA-approved decorations, stood a woman. Evan had never spoken to her, but he had heard enough stories from neighbors to know who she was. She was the unofficial HOA watchdog, the self-appointed rule enforcer. The kind of person who printed the rulebook and carried it around like a sheriff carried a badge. Her name was Linda. She stood stiffly with her arms crossed, squinting at him as though she were scanning his face for criminal intent. Evan offered a polite smile and a small nod, but she didn't return either gesture. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to identify him. He kept walking toward the cabin. If she had something to say, she would say it. If she didn't, then all the better. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine wood and old blankets. Dust floated in the shafts of sunlight coming through the windows. Everything felt just as he'd left it untouched, undisturbed. He dropped his bag on the couch, took a few minutes to open the windows, and let the late afternoon breeze swirl through. The drive had worn him out more than he expected. He had left before sunrise and didn't stop except for gas. He wasn't tired in the usual way. It was more of an exhaustion that lived deep in the bones. The kind of tired that made every muscle feel heavier than it should. He sat on the edge of the couch, leaned back, and let his eyes fall shut for a moment. A moment turned into minutes. Minutes turned into the kind of sleep that pulled him under without warning. When he opened his eyes again, the cabin was dim. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, and the cool evening air had drifted in through the open windows. Evan blinked, trying to figure out how long he'd been asleep. He checked his watch. Almost 2 hours. He sat up slowly, rubbing his neck. He hadn't meant to fall asleep so soon, but the stillness of the cabin had a way of draining the last drop of tension from his body. He considered making dinner, maybe even heating some soup on the old gas stove, but he didn't feel hungry. Instead, he stood, stretched, and closed the windows one by one. The night air was colder than he remembered from last year. Once the windows were shut, he switched on a small lamp, the only light he needed. The cabin was peaceful, but his body still felt leaden. He decided he would just lie down for a little while longer before unpacking anything. He kicked off his shoes, lay on the couch, pulled an old blanket over himself, and let his eyes shut again. Outside, the mountains softened into quiet darkness. The creek continued its gentle rush. The wind whispered through the trees and across the road. Unseen behind slightly parted curtains, Linda watched. She had seen the unfamiliar truck pull in earlier. She had watched the man get out, carrying a bag. She had seen him unlock the cabin door. Everything about the scene seemed wrong to her. In her mind, nobody visited that cabin anymore. The owner, whoever he was, hadn't been around since last year. She knew because she kept track of things like that. And so, when the lights went off early and no movement came from inside for hours, she convinced herself something suspicious was happening. The rulebook didn't say anything specific about unfamiliar vehicles or early lights out, but it didn't have to. She believed she had good judgment. She believed she could sense things before others noticed them. And most of all, she believed it was her responsibility to look out for the neighborhood. So she watched Evan, unaware of her eyes on the dark cabin, drifted into deeper sleep. His breathing settled into a slow rhythm. He didn't hear the crunch of footsteps as Linda wandered closer. He didn't hear the click of her phone camera as she zoomed in on his truck's license plate. He didn't hear her muttered comments about outsiders and possible break-ins. And he definitely didn't hear her debating with herself whether she should call the HOA, president, or the sheriff he was completely unaware of. Everything the night grew colder. At some point, Evan turned onto his side and tucked the blanket under his chin. His mind floated through a half-sleep full of half-formed thoughts, nothing serious enough to wake him. Nothing soothing enough to count as real rest. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, washing the mountains in silver light. The cabin sat dark and quiet, looking from a distance like no one was inside at all, and in the house across the road. Linda paced back and forth. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would someone arrive alone, go inside, and then disappear into silence? Why hadn't he turned on more lights? Why didn't he come back out? Why was the truck unfamiliar? Why didn't she recognize him from any HOA meetings or gatherings? Questions piled up in her mind like a stack of papers, spilling off a desk. She convinced herself that the cabin was being used by someone who did not belong there. She convinced herself that this situation was unsafe. And once she believed it, nothing could convince her otherwise. She stopped pacing. She grabbed her phone. Meanwhile, Evan slept, finally getting the rest he had needed for months. He didn't know that the next morning would be nothing like the peaceful weekend he had planned. He didn't know someone had already made up a story in their head about who he was. And he certainly didn't know that everything from here on was about to get much more complicated. But for now, the world stayed quiet, and he slept. With no idea of the chaos waiting just beyond the cabin door, the morning light crept slowly over the mountains. Soft at first, then brighter as it reached the tops of the trees. The cabin windows glowed faintly as the sun rose, and the quiet creek outside murmured the same gentle tune it always did. Inside the cabin, Evan was still asleep, wrapped in the old blanket, his breathing slow and steady. For a few peaceful minutes, everything was calm. Then came the knocking. It wasn't a friendly tap, or the kind of knock someone used when dropping by to say hello. It was sharp, fast, and impatient, like someone demanding attention. Evan stirred, groaned, and pulled the blanket over his head. He thought maybe it was a woodpecker, or the wind. But the knock came again, louder this time. He blinked awake, confused. The room was still dim, the lamp he'd forgotten to turn off casting a soft glow. He sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes, and listened. 3 more knocks. Hard, determined. Who on earth? He mumbled under his breath. He pushed the blanket aside and swung his legs to the floor. His joints protested, stiff from the awkward sleep position. He walked to the door, unsure what to expect. It was too early for deliveries, and he wasn't expecting anyone. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a second, then unlocked it and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was the last person he wanted to deal with so early in the morning. Linda? She had the same stiff posture as the day before. Arms crossed tightly, chin raised as if she were staring down a criminal rather than a sleepy man in wrinkled clothes. Behind her, the sunlight filtered through the trees, giving the whole scene an odd, dramatic glow. Evan cleared his throat. "Morning," he said, trying to sound polite despite being half awake. She didn't return the greeting. Her eyes were sharp, studying him like she was trying to catch him in a lie he hadn't even told. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And why are you in this cabin?" Evan blinked. "This is my cabin." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't think so." He stared at her for a moment, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Well, it is. I own this place." "I have never seen you here," she said, narrowing her eyes even more. "And I know every resident in this community." Evan forced a small smile. "I don't visit often, but I do own it." That didn't convince her at all. She took a step closer as if she could intimidate the truth out of him. "Do you have proof?" she asked. He ran a tired hand over his forehead. Didn't have the energy to play this game at sunrise. "Yes," he replied slowly. "Inside. My documents are in the drawer by the desk. I can show you." Before he could turn around, she lifted her chin sharply. "It's not necessary. The sheriff is already on the way." For a moment, Evan didn't react. He simply stood there, the words floating past him as his sleepy mind tried to make sense of them. "What?" he finally said. "I called last night," she said. "Suspicious activity. Possible trespassing." "You called the sheriff?" Evan repeated, not quite believing it. She nodded, her expression proud, as if she had done something heroic. "You arrived in an unfamiliar truck, entered the cabin, and then all the lights went off. I watched the place all night." Evan stared at her. "I was sleeping." "That's what a trespasser would say," she replied flatly. Before he could answer, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned his head and saw a sheriff's SUV pulling into the driveway. 2 deputies stepped out, one older, one younger. They didn't look aggressive or even annoyed. If anything, they looked like people who had already dealt with many early morning calls like this. Evan sighed deeply. This was not how he had planned to start his day. The older deputy approached first. "Morning," he said calmly. "We got a call about a possible break-in." "Are you the one staying here, sir?" "Yes," Evan said. "I'm the owner." Linda immediately stepped forward. "He says that, but he has no proof, and his truck is unfamiliar." And the deputy held up a hand, politely but firmly. "Ma'am, let's let him speak." She pressed her lips together, unwilling to argue with law enforcement, but clearly itching to continue. Evan took a breath. "I can get my documents." "They're inside. That'd be great," the deputy said, with a nod. Evan stepped back into the cabin, leaving the door open. He walked to the small desk against the wall and pulled open the drawer. Inside were files. He kept for the property insurance papers, tax documents, and the original purchase contract. He pulled out the folder and returned to the porch. The deputy took the documents, scanning through the pages. His expression remained calm the whole time. After a moment, he closed the folder and handed it back. "Everything checks out," he said. "This cabin belongs to him." Linda froze. "What?" "But I don't recognize him. He's never at the meetings. He doesn't follow any of the guidelines." "That's not a crime," the deputy said. "People have a right to use their own property." "But I know every resident," she insisted. "And I didn't approve of, ma'am," the deputy said. "That's not your responsibility." Evan watched her face turn stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't seem embarrassed. She seemed annoyed that things weren't going her way. The younger deputy stepped forward. "Sir, is everything okay here? Has anyone threatened you or caused damage?" Evan shook his head. "No, just misunderstanding." "Do you want us to stay or check the property?" the deputy asked. "No, thank you," Evan said. "I'm fine." The older deputy nodded. "All right, if you need anything, give us a call." He then turned to Linda, and "Ma'am, please remember that calling 911 for non-emergencies can lead to consequences. Make sure there's an actual emergency next time." Linda stiffened, as if the words were an insult. "I was trying to protect the community." "I understand," the deputy replied patiently. "But you have to be certain before making a report." The deputies walked back to their SUV. Linda stayed rooted in place, her face tight with frustration.
Ow.
When the vehicle started and rolled down the driveway, she turned her attention back to Evan. "I still don't believe this," she said. "Something about this feels wrong." Evan let out a tired breath. "What feels wrong is being treated like a criminal for sleeping in my own cabin. I'm not here to cause trouble." "You should inform the HOA when you visit," she said sharply. "There's no rule about that." "There should be," she snapped. Evan shook his head and gently pushed the door halfway closed. "Have a good day." He didn't wait for her to argue. He closed the door, softly, not slamming it, not making a scene, just easing it shut because he had no interest in fueling whatever drama lived in her mind. Inside, he leaned against the door and rubbed the bridge of his nose. It was barely 8 in the morning, and he already felt exhausted. He had come here for peace, not confrontation. But clearly the world had other plans. He set the documents back on the desk, then returned to the couch and sat down. He didn't know whether to laugh or sigh, maybe both. Outside, he heard Linda's footsteps moving away from the porch. She wasn't quiet about it. She stomped down the steps and across the gravel, muttering under her breath. He didn't catch the words, but he could guess the tone. Once she was gone, the quiet returned, but it didn't feel the same. The peace of the mountains was still outside. The creek still whispered. The birds still hopped along the branches. But the calm inside Evan's mind had cracked a little. He didn't like the idea of being watched. He didn't like that someone he'd never spoken to felt entitled to judge him the moment he arrived. He stood up and walked to the window. Across the road, Linda had gone inside her cabin. Through the thin curtains, he could see her pacing again, probably already planning her next step. He whispered to himself, "This weekend is off to a great start." He made coffee, hoping the warm drink would clear his head. As he stirred the cup, he thought about everything that had happened. It was strange. He had always known there were controlling personalities in the world, but he hadn't expected one to be so close, watching him from across the road. He wondered if the rest of the community was like her. He doubted it. Most people just wanted to enjoy their cabins and the quiet forest around them. He had met a few neighbors years ago, and they had been friendly, but things had changed. More cabins, more rules, more people feeling like they needed to be in charge. He sipped the coffee slowly, letting the heat settle into him. He tried to shake off the morning's chaos, didn't want to ruin his whole weekend over it. But a small voice in his mind told him this wouldn't be the last he heard from Linda. People like her didn't drop things easily. Later that morning, Evan stepped outside to get some fresh air. The sun had risen fully now, warming the forest floor. Birds called to each other from nearby branches. The crisp mountain air carried the earthy smell of pine needles. He walked down the steps and stretched his arms as he looked around the property. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, safe. Nothing out of place. He hoped that meant things had settled. But he was wrong. As he approached the small shed behind the cabin, he noticed something unusual. A piece of paper had been slipped under the handle, held in place by the morning dew. Pulled it free. It was a note, written in bold, almost angry handwriting. It read, "You cannot stay here without proper approval." Evan let his shoulders drop. So it had begun, and something told him it was only going to get worse from here. The morning grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, but inside Evan's chest, a heaviness lingered. He stared at the note in his hand for a long moment, trying to decide if he should laugh, sigh, or toss it in the creek. It was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But it also wasn't surprising. People like Linda didn't stop at one confrontation. They kept going until they felt they had one, whatever that meant in their minds. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. There was no point in getting worked up over it right now. Now when the whole reason he had come to the cabin was to escape stress, not collect more of it. He took another slow breath of the fresh air, letting the smell of pine help settle his nerves, and walked back toward the cabin. The gravel crunched under his boots, and the morning light sparkled along the creek. It was peaceful, almost peaceful enough to forget the situation. But as he reached the porch, he saw a movement from the corner of his eye. Across the road, behind her front window, Linda was watching him again. She wasn't even trying to hide it this time. Her curtain was pulled only halfway over the glass, leaving her face clearly visible as she stared. Evan paused. Their eyes met. She didn't look away. He tapped his fingers lightly against the porch railing and forced himself not to react. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of showing irritation, because that was exactly the kind of reaction people like her enjoyed. He turned and went inside. For a while, he tried distracting himself. He made a proper breakfast: eggs, toast, and a handful of berries he had packed. He went through his things to see what groceries he needed to buy later in town. He even sat on the couch and tried reading a book. But every 10 minutes or so, he felt that prickle again, the one that came from being watched. Finally, after nearly an hour of trying to ignore it, he walked to the front window and lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to peek outside. She was still there, standing on her porch now, arms crossed, staring straight at the cabin. Evan let the curtain fall back into place. "This is insane," he muttered. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply existing on his own property. But the way she looked at him made him feel like a suspect, not a homeowner. He wasn't tense only because she was watching. He was tense because he knew people like her didn't stop at watching. They escalated, and he was right. About 20 minutes later, he heard another knock. A lighter, more polite knock than earlier. Not the kind that meant trouble. The kind that meant someone reasonable was on the other side. He opened the door to his surprise. It wasn't Linda. It was a man he vaguely recognized. Tall, middle-aged, friendly. Someone he had seen once or twice years ago when he first bought the cabin. "Morning," the man said. "Hope I'm not bothering you." "Oh, not at all," Evan replied. "Can I help you?" The man glanced over his shoulder before leaning in slightly. "I'm just going to say it straight. Don't mind her." Evan tried not to smile. "I take it you mean the neighbor across the road." The man chuckled. "She's been enthusiastic lately." "That's one word," Evan said. The man nodded. "She was going door to door this morning telling folks there was a trespasser in the community." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, him the trespasser." The man gave a sympathetic shrug. According to her, yes. But most of us didn't think it was true. She does this kind of thing a lot. Calls the HOA over lawn decorations. Reports people for parking too close to their own gardens. Claims she hears suspicious footsteps every other night. Evan sighed. "So it's a pattern." "Oh yeah," the man said. "A big one." Paused. "Sorry you had to deal with her first thing this morning." "It's fine," Evan replied. "The deputies checked everything and left." "I figured they would. She calls them more than she calls her own relatives." They both chuckled softly. The man extended his hand. "I'm Carl, by the way. Cabin 2 lots down by the big rock." Evan shook his hand. "Evan." Carl nodded warmly. "Well, welcome back. Folks around here aren't all like her. Most of us mind our own business." "I appreciate that," Evan said sincerely. "If you need anything, or if she keeps bothering you, just holler," Carl added. "She can't really do anything. She just likes acting like she runs the place." Evan glanced toward Linda's cabin. "Yeah, I noticed." Carl laughed. "She calmed down eventually. I hope." After a few more exchanged pleasantries, Carl headed off, giving a small wave as he walked down the gravel road. Evan felt a little better after that conversation. At least he knew he wasn't alone in thinking the situation was over the top. Still, the tension lingered. He stepped back inside and grabbed the note from his pocket again. Proper approval, it said. Approval for what? For existing. He placed the note on the counter and shook his head. He wasn't going to let it ruin his whole day. He decided to take a walk, clear his mind, enjoy the creek, breathe. The forest trails behind the cabin were some of his favorite places. He needed that quiet. He grabbed a jacket and stepped outside. But the moment he closed the door behind him, he heard Linda's voice. "Where are you going now?" He froze for a second before turning toward her. She was once again standing on her porch, her voice sharp and suspicious. "For a walk," he said. His tone was controlled, steady. "Can't just wander around," she declared. "Why not?" Evan asked. "Because you still haven't proved you belong here? Those papers could be forged." Evan blinked slowly. The deputies already confirmed everything. They don't know this community as well as I do, she replied, as if that settled the matter. Evan considered replying but stopped himself. There was no winning an argument with someone who didn't want to hear reason. He took a deep breath. "Have a good day," he said simply, then walked away. He followed the narrow trail behind his cabin, where fallen pine needles softened each step and birds hopped between branches. The forest felt alive, warm, welcoming the exact opposite of the tension waiting back on the road. As he walked, the weight on his shoulders slowly lifted. The quiet helped. The towering trees helped. The steady rhythm of his footsteps helped. By the time he reached the creek crossing deeper in the woods, his mind had settled again. He stood by the water and watched the sunlight flicker across the surface. The sound of rushing water was like a gentle hum that wiped his thoughts clean. For the first time that day, he felt like he could breathe fully. He stayed by the creek for almost an hour, just listening, just being, letting the calm find him again. But peace never lasted long around people like Linda. When he returned to the cabin, he spotted something in the driveway. A small crowd, 4 neighbors, standing with their arms folded, all facing his cabin, and in front of them Linda. She was talking loudly, her voice spilling across the quiet morning like someone had turned the volume too high. As he approached, everyone turned their eyes toward him. "There he is," Linda announced. "That's him. The man I was telling you about?" The neighbors looked at Evan with a range of expressions: curiosity, confusion, mild concern, but none looked angry. It was clear they had been summoned, not that they had come willingly. Evan stopped a few feet from them. "Morning," one of the neighbors, a woman with a sun hat and a kind face, stepped forward slightly. We just wanted to get some clarity," Miss Linda cut in. "We need confirmation of his identity." "No, we don't," the woman said gently. "We just came because she asked us to. She said there was an important community issue." "It is an important issue," Linda insisted. "He shouldn't be here without permission." Evan folded his arms loosely, not defensive, just steady. "I don't need permission to stay in my own cabin." One of the men in the group frowned. "This is your cabin?" "Yes," Evan said. "It's been mine for years." "Then why does she think you don't belong here?" the man asked. Evan gave a faint smile that held more patience than he felt. "You'll have to ask her." All eyes turned to Linda. She stiffened, her jaw tightening. "I have never seen him before," she said, "and I know everyone. So clearly something is wrong." One of the other neighbors sighed softly. "You don't have to know everyone." "Yes, I do," she snapped. "No, actually, you don't," the neighbor replied. Evan could tell this wasn't the first time they had dealt with her stubbornness. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded documents, and held them up. "The deputies already verified everything, but if it helps put everyone at ease, I'm willing to show you as well." The group exchanged glances. No one looked skeptical, they simply looked tired of the whole ordeal. But before Evan could open the folder, the sound of tires rolling over gravel echoed through the trees. Another vehicle approached. Not the sheriff's SUV this time, a black car. One. Evan recognized immediately, the HOA president. The moment the car stopped, Linda straightened like a soldier waiting for praise. The HOA president stepped out, a man with a calm face, thoughtful eyes, and the tired look of someone who had been dealing with too many complaints lately. He scanned the group, then looked at Evan, then at Linda. "What's going on this time?" he asked. Linda stepped forward proudly. "I caught him trespassing. He refuses to leave. He won't show proper paperwork." The president raised an eyebrow. "The deputies were here this morning? They already handled this."
"Oh, yes."
"But they don't understand our rules," she insisted. "We don't have a rule about visiting your own cabin," the president replied. Linda opened her mouth, then shut it. She wasn't expecting resistance from him. The president sighed, rubbed his forehead, then turned to Evan. "Sir, I'm sorry for all this. I really am. If you could just confirm your ownership, we can put this to rest." Evan handed him the papers. The president opened the folder and read quietly. His eyes widened slightly. He looked at Evan, then back at the papers. then at Evan again. There was a shift in his posture, a sudden recognition, a sudden seriousness. He handed the papers back carefully. "Everything is in order," the president said. "And more than that, you should have informed us you were arriving. It would have saved a lot of trouble." Linda frowned. "Why would he need to inform you?" The president took a slow breath. "Because he's not just a cabin owner." The group fell silent. "He's a major investor in the development," the president continued. Linda's face went blank. The others gasped softly, and the president added, "He recently joined our board." Linda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Evan stood quietly, watching her expression shift from confusion to disbelief, to something almost like fear, and this was only the beginning. The morning sunlight was already slipping through the cracks of the cabin shutters. When everything finally quieted down outside, after the long, stressful night, the air felt strangely calm. It's the kind that made someone pause and wonder what was coming next. Inside the cabin, the man moved slowly, still tired from having been woken up by flashing lights only hours before. He breathed out long and steady as he cleaned up the leftover mess and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up his back. He had barely taken a sip of water when he heard a faint knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, not like the pounding he had heard when the woman had been yelling the night before. This one was softer, like someone approaching with hesitation. He put his cup down and opened the door, expecting maybe one deputy returning with a question. Instead, he saw two men from the sheriff's office, both of them standing calmly with hands relaxed. They greeted him politely and explained that they had been told to check in and make sure everything had settled. He thanked them, and they seemed relieved to see him in better shape than they had imagined. One of the deputies asked if he had slept at all, and the man laughed lightly, admitting only a little. The deputy nodded in sympathy, saying situations like these always created headaches for everyone involved. But as much as the sheriff's office wanted to be done with the situation, the woman didn't feel the same. She had refused to accept the explanation given to her. Even after the deputies left last night, she had been pacing around with a flashlight, convinced something wasn't right. The officers explained that she had already called again that morning, asking for clarification about the man staying in the cabin. He sighed, rubbing his face with one hand. He knew this wasn't over, but he had hoped for a small break before the next round. The deputies assured him they didn't believe her claims and that they were only checking in out of courtesy. When they finally excused themselves, the man shut the door slowly, letting the quiet settle again. For a moment he leaned against the wood, letting his shoulders drop. He had bought this place for peace, just a quiet retreat away from constant responsibilities. But somehow, peace was the last thing he was getting. He decided to step outside and breathe a little. The sun was brighter now, reaching the tops of the pine trees behind the cabin. The cool mountain air brushed against his cheeks, carrying the scent of morning dew. He stood for a moment just taking it in, until he heard the sound of hurried footsteps crunching over gravel. He turned to see Hertha, same woman from last night, as the one who had caused the chaos. She was marching toward him with a file folder tucked under her arm and an expression that seemed carved out of cold stone. She stopped a few steps away from him. Her chin lifted as if preparing for an argument she expected to win. The man didn't say anything at first. He simply watched, letting her make the first move. She took a breath and said she wanted to clear things up, but immediately shifted into her familiar tone. One that sounded like she was talking at him, not to him. She accused him again of staying without permission. She said the HOA had rules about unapproved guests and overnight use, and she didn't recall seeing his name on any recent homeowner lists. She demanded to know where he had gotten the keys to the cabin. She spoke without stopping, her voice sharp and restless. The man listened patiently at first, but her accusations grew harder to take seriously. He finally held up one hand, signaling her to slow down. He explained gently but firmly that he didn't owe her explanations beyond what he had already given. He told her the deputies had confirmed his identity and ownership, but she refused to accept it and insisted she would be reporting this to the board immediately. He tried to stay calm, but it was clear she wasn't interested in any truth that didn't fit her assumptions. She continued, almost shouting now. saying she wouldn't allow strangers to take over properties in her community. Her community. The phrase hit the man the wrong way. Not because she cared about the neighborhood, he respected that, but because she had no idea who she was talking to. He took a step forward. Not aggressive, just enough to let her know her words carried weight they shouldn't. He spoke slowly, so she could hear every word clearly. He told her he wasn't a stranger. He told her he wasn't breaking any rule. And then he revealed the part he had been avoiding since he first arrived. He explained that he wasn't just the owner of the cabin. He held a major financial stake in the entire development, one that gave him decision-making power over the HOA itself. The papers she kept clinging to, the rules she believed she controlled, all came from a board he had joined not too long ago. She had no idea, but she had been yelling at one of the people who actually had the authority to change the rules. She was waving around. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, not the air, not the trees, but her expression. Her mouth was slightly open, though no words came out. Her confident stance melted into stiff confusion. She stared at him like she wasn't sure if she should believe him. Her grip on her folder loosened a little. She blinked slowly, as if processing a language she didn't speak. The man didn't raise his voice, didn't brag, didn't insult her. He simply told her the truth she had refused to consider. He also said he didn't want to embarrass her or make things harder. All he wanted was to enjoy a quiet weekend without being treated like a criminal. She stuttered as she tried to form a reply. But the man could tell she had lost whatever argument she thought she was winning. She dropped her gaze and took a small step back, her posture shrinking. For the first time since he met her, she didn't look angry, she looked unsure. A few words slipped out of her, something close to an apology, though she didn't fully say the word. She muttered that she had only been doing her job, that she was trying to protect the neighborhood. The man nodded. He didn't want to humiliate her. He understood that some people took their roles too seriously, thinking it was the only way to keep things in order, but protecting a neighborhood. And assuming the worst about everyone were very different things, he told her calmly that she needed to call the HOA office later. Not because he wanted to get her in trouble, but because it was only right that she corrected the report she had filed. She froze again this time out of fear of admitting she had been wrong. He reassured her it was better to address it now than let it become a bigger issue. She nodded slowly, looking down at the ground. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps much quieter than when she had arrived. The man watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. He went back inside the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. The place felt calm again, but the tension from the past day had left a mark. He sat down, letting the quiet fill the room. What he didn't know was that this moment, the calm after the reveal, was only the start. The community would learn the truth soon enough. Things would change in ways he hadn't even begun to imagine. For now, though, he simply needed to rest and gather his thoughts. The storm had passed, but a new kind of silence was settling in the air. One that hinted something bigger was still on the way. The day after everything happened, the cabin felt a little different. The quiet was the same, the trees were the same, the crisp air was the same, but something inside the man had settled. He felt lighter, as if revealing the truth had lifted a weight he didn't even know he was carrying. Still, he knew his peaceful weekend was long gone. What happened with the woman would spread through the community. There was no stopping it. He stepped outside and walked toward the porch, sipping warm coffee from a mug. The sunlight was soft, falling across the pine needles like a calm reminder that nature didn't care about arguments or paperwork or restless neighbors. The world outside the cabin kept moving, no matter what had happened the night before, but the peace lasted only a moment before the sound of a car engine approached. A small SUV rolled down the gravel road and stopped near the cabin. 3 people stepped out. They weren't sheriff deputies, and they weren't neighbors. They looked like regular folks dressed in simple mountain clothes, holding folders and clipboards. The man recognized them instantly. They were members of the HOA board. He placed his mug down slowly on the railing and walked toward them, keeping his expression calm. They greeted him politely, but he could already sense a mix of nervousness and embarrassment in the way. They shifted their weight and cleared their throats. One of them stepped forward and explained they were conducting an urgent in-person. Check-in after receiving early morning reports. The woman from the night before had apparently written a long email to the entire board, claiming she had saved the community from a possible break-in. She had mentioned calling the sheriff, filing a complaint, and confronting the trespasser, but she had left out a very important detail. The man smiled gently as he listened. He appreciated that the board members had come themselves instead of relying on rumors. He invited them inside the cabin, offering them seats and something warm to drink. They declined the drink, but accepted the seats. Once everyone settled, he explained the situation from start to finish. He told them how he arrived, how the woman had confronted him, how she had called the sheriff, and how she refused to believe the truth even when proof was given. The board members listened carefully, their expressions shifting from concern to disbelief to embarrassment. After the story was laid out, he paused for a moment before revealing the final part, the part about him being a major investor and one of the silent decision-makers behind the development. That was when the room went very quiet. The board members exchanged stunned looks. They knew investors. They worked with them all the time, but none of them had expected to meet one this way, and certainly not in the middle of a misunderstanding that involved law enforcement. One of them finally spoke, apologizing sincerely for the trouble he had gone through. They admitted the woman had a history of overstepping. She had reported people for having outdoor lights too bright, for leaving trash bins out too long, even for parking slightly crooked. But never had she caused something this serious. The man nodded. He wasn't angry. He wasn't looking to punish anyone. He simply wanted the board to understand what had happened and make sure situations like this didn't happen again. He wanted the community to feel safe, not watched. The board members agreed completely. They explained they would hold an emergency meeting to address her behavior and decide whether she should continue. As a volunteer supervisor, they also said they would update the homeowner's directory to make sure everyone knew who he was. Preventing future confusion, the man thanked them. They thanked him again, and after a few more words exchanged in calmer tones, the board member stood up, shook his hand, and left the cabin. For the first time all weekend, the man felt like things were finally moving in the right direction. Later that afternoon, he decided to take a walk through the neighborhood trails. The forest paths were peaceful, lined with tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Birds chirped overhead, and the soft crunch of pine needles under his shoes gave the trail a warm, grounding feeling. A few minutes into the walk, he noticed a figure sitting on a bench just off the path. It was the woman. She looked tired, almost drained, as if the weight of everything had finally settled on her shoulders. He could have walked past her. He had every reason to, but something made him stop. Maybe he didn't want the story to end with bitterness. Maybe he wanted closure. Or maybe he simply wanted the community to become better, not more divided. He approached slowly, giving her space so she wouldn't feel cornered. She looked up when she heard footsteps, and her eyes widened slightly when she recognized him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze filled the silence, carrying the gentle rustle of leaves. Eventually, she stood, clutching the strap of her bag with both hands. Her voice trembled slightly as she said she didn't mean for everything to get so out of hand. She had believed she was protecting the neighborhood. She said she had seen trouble before in other communities she lived in, and she didn't want the same things happening here. The man listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look annoyed. He just let her speak. When she finally finished, he nodded. He understood how people could feel protective over their homes. He understood how fear could turn into overreaction. But he reminded her gently that assumptions could hurt people too, and jumping to conclusions didn't make anyone safer. She lowered her head and nodded silently. He didn't try to lecture her further. He simply told her he hoped things could be different moving forward, that the community didn't need fear to stay safe. Only respect and communication. She held his gaze for a few seconds, then whispered a small thank you. As if surprised he was being kind to her after everything she had done, he gave her a small smile, then continued down the trail, letting the sun warm his face as he walked. When he reached the cabin again, he felt a gentle sense of closure settling in. The weekend had turned into something much more chaotic than he ever planned. But he chose to believe something good would come out of it. The board was taking action. The truth was out. And the woman seemed to finally understand the impact of her choices. That evening, as the sky faded into soft orange tones, he sat on the porch again, listening to the wind. He thought about how easily misunderstanding could turn into conflict. How one assumption could scatter into a chain of events that touched far more people than expected. But he also thought about how things had ended with honesty, clarity, and a chance for change. 2 days later, the board held their emergency meeting. It wasn't dramatic or heated. It was straightforward. Many residents attended, curious after hearing bits and pieces of the story. The woman stood in front of them, looking smaller than usual, her voice quieter. She apologized publicly for the misunderstanding and promised to step back from her volunteer role. People were surprised, but they respected her courage to admit her mistakes. Afterward, the board introduced the man formally, explaining his connection to the development and his hopes for a more welcoming environment. The community members greeted him warmly. Some apologized on behalf of the neighborhood. Others thanked him for being patient instead of retaliating. In that moment, he felt something shift, not just in him, but in the whole group. A place that once felt tense and suspicious now felt open, grounded, and ready to grow. A few weeks later, he returned to the cabin for another quiet weekend. Something unexpected happened. People waved at him. A couple walking their dogs said hello. A man trimming bushes near his yard greeted him with a friendly nod. Even children riding their bikes slowed down to say hi. The woman from before wasn't as active around the neighborhood anymore. She kept more to herself, but whenever their paths crossed, she offered a polite smile. Not a forced one, not an awkward one, just simple and human. And the man appreciated that one evening. As he sat by the porch again, watching the sun dip behind the trees, he thought back to the moment she had called the police on him. It felt like a lifetime ago. And while the memory wasn't pleasant, he couldn't deny that everything that followed had brought real change. Sometimes, he thought, disruption leads to understanding. Mistakes lead to growth. And misunderstandings bring people together if handled with patience. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet mountain air settle around him. This cabin, once just a place to escape the world, had become the start of a story that shaped an entire community. And as the soft breeze whispered through the trees, he closed his eyes and smiled, grateful for the peace he had finally found.